Welcome to the historical decoder. In just 30 years, humanity nearly destroyed itself twice. Entire empires collapsed. Ancient cities burned. Millions of young men marched off to war and never returned home. The 20th century began with optimism, industry, and the belief that modern civilization had reached its golden age. But beneath that progress, something far more dangerous was growing. Nationalism, imperial ambition, and a rivalry between the world's greatest powers that would soon spiral beyond anyone's control. Then the world exploded, from the muddy trenches of the Western Front to the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, from the burning streets of London to the vast, blood-soaked waters of the Pacific. Humanity was pulled into two catastrophic conflicts that reshaped civilization forever. These were not merely wars over borders or territory. They were battles that tested the very spirit of mankind. Millions answered the call of duty, leaving behind their homes, their families, and the lives they once knew. Entire nations mobilized for survival. Cities vanished beneath firestorms. And ordinary people were forced to endure extraordinary horrors. Yet even in humanity's darkest hours, courage endured. This is the story of how the modern world was forged in the fires of World War I and World War II. A story of sacrifice, industrial might, political ambition, unimaginable destruction, and the unyielding hope that peace could still emerge from the ashes of global catastrophe. Tonight, we journey back into the defining decades of the 20th century to uncover the leaders, battles, tragedies, and everyday heroes behind the wars that changed humanity forever. So settle in and let us decode history. The visual recreations in this documentary utilize digital tools for illustrative purposes, but all historical facts, scripts, and research are strictly human verified and based on authentic archives. Part 1. The World Before the Great War. To understand the sudden cataclysmic eruption of the First World War, we must first look at the world at the dawn of the 20th century. It was an era that, on the surface, appeared to be a golden age of unprecedented progress and boundless optimism. The Industrial Revolution had utterly transformed Western societies, bringing about marvels of engineering, soaring economies, and a widespread, almost arrogant belief that humanity was on an unstoppable upward path. Railroads connected once distant cities. The telegraph made instant global communication possible. And international trade was booming. Yet, beneath this glittering veneer of prosperity and elegance, deep and dangerous fractures were forming in the foundations of global stability. Europe was a continent dominated by sprawling, centuries-old empires. The British, the French, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the newly unified, highly ambitious German Empire. Ironically, the monarchs of these great powers were largely members of one extended family, many being the grandchildren of Britain's Queen Victoria. But familial ties were no match for nationalistic pride and imperial ambition. These great powers were locked in an intense, quiet rivalry. Driven by an insatiable desire for global influence and raw materials to feed their factories, they scrambled for colonial territories across Africa and Asia. This fierce competition fostered a climate of deep suspicion and paranoia. Fearing each other's growing might, nations began pouring vast, unprecedented resources into a massive arms race. The oceans became a theater of intimidation, sparked by the British launch of the HMS Dreadnought, a battleship so advanced it instantly rendered all other navies obsolete. Germany scrambled to build its own fleet, alarming London. Concurrently, standing armies on the continent swelled to millions of men. To protect themselves in this atmosphere of mutual distrust, these empires wove a complex, highly rigid web of secret alliances. The continent was effectively split into two heavily armed camps, the Triple Entente, comprising Great Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, uniting Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. It was a delicate, precarious balance of power, a geopolitical house of cards, where an attack on one nation would legally obligate the others to march to war. The nations of Europe had inadvertently constructed a massive powder keg, filling it to the brim with nationalism, militarism, and imperial envy. They believed their alliances would act as a deterrent, but what they did not realize was that they had created a trap. All it needed was a single, solitary spark in the right place to ignite a catastrophe that would burn the old world to the ground. And as we will soon see, that spark was destined to be struck in the most volatile corner of Europe. Part 2. The Outbreak of World War I. That fatal spark was struck on a warm summer day, June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, located in the turbulent region known as the Balkans. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the aging Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a young Serbian nationalist. In another era, in isolated circumstances, this tragic but localized event might have resulted in a brief regional conflict or a diplomatic crisis. But because of the intricate, hidden web of European alliances, the situation rapidly, almost mechanically, spiraled out of control in what became known as the July Crisis. When Austria-Hungary, backed by a blank check of support from Germany, issued an impossible ultimatum to Serbia and declared war, the dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. Russia, feeling a duty to protect its Slavic brethren in Serbia, mobilized its massive army. Germany, adhering to a strict, inflexible military strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan, declared war on Russia and its ally, France. The German plan relied on a lightning-fast strike through neutral Belgium to capture Paris before the vast Russian army could fully mobilize in the east. But the brutal violation of Belgian neutrality outraged the world and forced Great Britain to immediately enter the fray to uphold its treaty obligations. Within mere weeks of a political assassination, the major powers of Europe had plunged over the abyss. Initially, there was a profound disconnect between the reality of the impending conflict and the public's perception. Millions of young men enthusiastically rushed to enlist, cheered on by patriotic crowds, believing the illusion that it would be a swift, glorious campaign over by Christmas. The reality they met was a nightmare. The armies of 1914 clashed using outdated 19th century tactics, infantry charges in brightly colored uniforms against the devastating mechanized reality of 20th century technology. The introduction of the modern machine gun, rapid-fire heavy artillery, and eventually the horrifying deployment of chemical weapons transformed the lush European landscape into a desolate, cratered wasteland. Following the miraculous French and British stand at the First Battle of the Marne, where Parisian taxicabs were famously used to ferry reserve troops to the front line, the conflict ground to a brutal, agonizing stalemate. The war of movement died. In its place, a vast, complex network of trenches was carved into the earth, stretching continuously from the Swiss border to the freezing waters of the North Sea. Soldiers endured unimaginable, hellish conditions. They lived for months in freezing mud, battling disease and rats, facing the constant, mind-shattering roar of artillery bombardments, and fighting and dying for mere yards of scarred, blood-soaked earth. For years, through infamous battles like Verdun and the Somme, the lines barely moved, exacting a toll on human life that the world had never before witnessed. The Great War had become a grinding war of attrition, testing not just the armies, but the total economic and psychological endurance of entire nations. And as Europe bled, eyes turned westward across the Atlantic to a sleeping giant that was trying desperately to stay out of the fire. Part 3. America enters the war, and the end of World War I. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched the European devastation with a mixture of horror and a profound, deep-seated desire to remain neutral. President Woodrow Wilson, reflecting the overwhelming sentiment of the American people, urged citizens to be impartial in thought as well as in action. America was a nation of immigrants, many of whom had fled the very empires now tearing each other apart. However, as the conflict dragged on, maintaining this isolationist stance became increasingly impossible. The turning point in American sentiment began with the sinking of the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania in 1915 by a German U-boat. Among the nearly 1,200 dead were 128 Americans. The tragedy sparked outrage across the United States, straining diplomatic relations to the breaking point. Yet, it was in early 1917 that the scales truly and irreversibly tipped. Desperate to break the British naval blockade that was starving its population, Germany made the fateful decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking American merchant ships without warning. If that wasn't enough to provoke the United States, a stunning piece of intelligence sealed the deal. British codebreakers intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, a secret, audacious message from the German Foreign Secretary proposing a military alliance with Mexico. Germany promised that if Mexico attacked the United States, they would help Mexico recover lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The publication of this telegram galvanized the American public. The threat was no longer an ocean away. It was at their very doorstep. In April 1917, America officially entered the conflict, with President Wilson solemnly declaring that the world must be made safe for democracy. The arrival of the American Expeditionary Forces, the brave, energetic doughboys, led by the uncompromising General John J. Pershing, was the turning point of the war. They brought a crucial psychological boost to the exhausted, mutinous French and British ranks, and they brought the immense, untapped industrial and demographic resources of the United States. In the sprawling, bloody Meuse-Argonne offensive of 1918, the largest and deadliest campaign in United States military history, over 1 million American soldiers pushed through dense forests and fortified German lines, breaking the back of the enemy's resistance. By the fall of 1918, facing absolute military collapse and massive civilian uprisings at home, the combined might of the Allies pushed the Central Powers to their breaking point. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns finally fell silent. An armistice was signed. The sheer silence on the Western Front was deafening. The following year, world leaders gathered to draft the Treaty of Versailles, seeking to establish a lasting peace and an ambitious League of Nations. However, driven by a desire for vengeance, the European victors imposed crippling financial reparations, territorial losses, and a humiliating war guilt clause upon Germany. Many wise observers at the time warned that this was not a peace but merely a 20-year truce. They were tragically correct. The treaty left deep, festering scars of resentment, inadvertently sowing the dark seeds for a global turmoil that would be even more devastating than the last. Part 4. The Rise of Dictators and the Great Depression. The decade following the Great War was a period of profound contradictions and stark contrasts. In America, it was the era of the Roaring Twenties. Returning soldiers fueled a booming economy. It was a time of jazz, flappers, the widespread adoption of the automobile, and a rapid shift in cultural norms. Cities expanded upwards with towering skyscrapers, and the stock market seemed to offer a one-way ticket to endless wealth. Yet, across much of the globe, Particularly in Europe, the aftermath of the war had left economies incredibly fragile and societies deeply traumatized. This fragile global illusion of prosperity was entirely shattered in October 1929 with the sudden, catastrophic crash of the Wall Street stock market. Fortunes vanished overnight. The ensuing Great Depression spread like a dark, suffocating cloud over the world, bringing widespread unemployment, bank failures, poverty, and profound desperation. In the United States, bread lines stretched for blocks, and the Dust Bowl ravaged the heartland, displacing millions. But while democracies struggled to feed their people, the economic ruin in other parts of the world paved the way for something far more sinister. Desperate times invariably lead desperate populations to seek radical, authoritarian solutions, and this era was a fertile breeding ground for tyranny. In Italy, a former journalist named Benito Mussolini had already consolidated power, capitalizing on post-war grievances to install a fascist regime. He crushed political opposition and promised to restore the legendary glory and dominance of the ancient Roman Empire. But the most dangerous transformation occurred in Germany. Financially ruined by the Great Depression, scarred by the memory of wheelbarrows full of worthless cash during the hyperinflation of the 1920s, and humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, the German populace was incredibly vulnerable. Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party capitalized masterfully on this public anger and economic despair. Through a combination of fiery, mesmerizing rhetoric, violent intimidation, and political maneuvering, they systematically dismantled the democratic Weimar Republic. By 1933, a ruthless, totalitarian dictatorship was established, built on a foundation of dangerous racial ideologies and a promise to restore German dominance. Meanwhile, in the East, another threat was rising: the Empire of Japan. Driven by a rapidly growing population and a severe lack of the natural resources required for its industrial ambitions, fell under the total control of deeply militaristic leaders. They envisioned an empire dominating all of Asia and embarked on an aggressive, brutal campaign of expansion, invading Manchuria and later the rest of China. The international community watched with growing alarm. The League of Nations, established specifically to prevent future conflicts through collective security, proved completely toothless and powerless to stop these aggressive territorial expansions. When dictators tested the waters, Mussolini invading Ethiopia, Hitler remilitarizing the Rhineland, the democratic nations, still traumatized by the horrors of the First World War, chose the path of appeasement, hoping that giving in to demands would prevent another war. But you cannot appease a tiger by feeding it. The world was slowly, inexorably, slipping back toward the abyss. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the curtain was about to rise on the darkest chapter in human history. Part 5. The beginning of World War II. The dark clouds that had been gathering for a decade finally broke in September of 1939. Emboldened by years of Western appeasement and having secured a shocking, secret non-aggression pact with his ideological enemy, the Soviet Union, the German leader ordered the full-scale invasion of Poland. The world watched in absolute shock as a new, terrifying form of warfare was unleashed upon the Polish defenders, the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. This revolutionary military strategy abandoned the static trench warfare of the past. Instead, it utilized rapidly advancing concentrated armored divisions, the Panzers, supported directly by overwhelming, screaming dive bombers from above. This combination swiftly paralyzed communications, disoriented the defenders, and overwhelmed entire armies in a matter of days. In response to the invasion, Great Britain and France realizing that appeasement was a catastrophic failure, honored their alliances with Poland and declared war. The Second World War had officially begun. Yet, for months, an eerie quiet settled over Western Europe, a period journalists dubbed the phony war. But in the spring of 1940, the illusion of safety was shattered. The speed and ferocity of the Axis advance in the West was staggering. Through a series of rapid, stunning campaigns, they bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line, sweeping through the Low Countries and into France. The British and French armies were outflanked and pushed all the way to the sea. In one of the most remarkable logistical feats in military history, the miracle of Dunkirk saw over 300,000 trapped Allied soldiers evacuated across the English Channel by an armada of civilian fishing boats, pleasure cruisers, and merchant marine vessels. But the continent was lost. By June 1940, Paris had fallen. Great Britain, separated from the enemy only by a narrow strip of water, stood essentially alone against the seemingly invincible Axis juggernaut. Hitler planned an invasion of Britain. But first, he needed to control the skies. What followed was the Battle of Britain, a desperate, months-long aerial duel. The German Luftwaffe unleashed relentless bombing campaigns over British airfields and cities, an ordeal known as the Blitz. Yet, under the resolute, inspiring leadership of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whose soaring rhetoric strengthened the resolve of the British people, the spirit of the nation remained unbroken. Aided by the newly developed technology of radar, the brave pilots of the Royal Air Force fought tirelessly, inflicting heavy losses on the attackers and forcing Hitler to indefinitely postpone his invasion. Churchill famously immortalized these pilots, stating, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Frustrated by his failure to crush Great Britain in the West, the Axis command made a fateful, deeply arrogant decision in the summer of 1941. They tore up their treaty with the Soviets and launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive, multi-million-man surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. This opened a brutal, unforgiving Eastern Front, stretching Axis resources across a vast landscape. They expected a quick victory, but they severely underestimated the sheer vastness of the Russian territory, the endless manpower of the Red Army, and the paralyzing, deadly grip of the approaching Russian winter. This decision would ultimately prove to be their greatest, most fatal miscalculation. Part 6. A World at War. While total war raged across Europe and deep into the Soviet Union, the United States remained officially neutral. However, recognizing the existential threat posed by the Axis powers, President Franklin D. Roosevelt sought ways to support the desperate Allies. He championed the Lend-Lease Act, boldly declaring that America must become the arsenal of democracy. Through this program, mountains of American-made tanks, aircraft, food, and ammunition flowed across the treacherous U-boat-infested Atlantic to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. America was the economic engine of the Allied war effort, but the public still deeply resisted sending their sons to fight on foreign soil. But the illusion of American safety was shattered on a quiet Sunday morning. In the Pacific, the United States had imposed crippling oil embargoes on Japan in response to their aggressive expansion in Asia. Driven to a corner and requiring resources to fuel their empire, Imperial Japanese forces made a massive gamble. On December 7, 1941, a date President Roosevelt famously declared would live in infamy, they launched a sudden, devastating surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet, anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, much of the American battleship fleet was crippled, and thousands of American lives were lost. The isolationist debate in America ended that very morning. The American response was immediate righteous, and completely unified. The United States was now thrust into a truly global, two-front conflict. Across the country, the industrial might of the nation was mobilized with an astonishing speed that shocked the Axis powers. Automobile factories ceased civilian production overnight, retooling their assembly lines to produce Sherman tanks, B-17 bombers, and artillery shells. Shipyards operated around the clock, miraculously building massive Liberty ships faster than enemy submarines could sink them. Millions of men lined up at recruiting stations, while millions of women, symbolized by the iconic, muscle-flexing Rosie the Riveter, stepped into the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They became welders, mechanics, and engineers, keeping the engines of heavy industry roaring and forever changing the American social landscape. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the news from the Pacific was grim, marked by defeats and tragedies like the Bataan Death March. But the American spirit refused to break. The psychological tide shifted with the daring Doolittle raid, a bold, long-range bomber strike on Tokyo that proved Japan was vulnerable. This was followed by a miraculous turning point. At the Battle of Midway in mid-1942, American naval intelligence brilliantly cracked the Japanese naval codes, allowing an outgunned American fleet to ambush the Japanese forces, sinking 4 of their vital aircraft carriers in a single day. From that moment on, the sprawling conflict in the Pacific transformed into a grueling, bloody island-hopping campaign, slowly and agonizingly pushing the enemy back toward their home islands, one contested beach at a time. The sleeping giant was fully awake, and its terrible resolve was about to be felt across the globe. Part 7. The Allied Counteroffensive. By late 1942 and throughout 1943, the relentless momentum of the Axis powers was halted, and the immense tide of the global conflict slowly, grindingly began to turn. The Axis armies, stretched dangerously thin across thousands of miles, faced mounting coordinated resistance from the unified, determined forces of the Grand Alliance. On the brutal Eastern Front, the profound endurance of the Soviet forces culminated in the monumental, apocalyptic struggle at Stalingrad. In the frozen, shattered ruins of the city, Soviet and German soldiers fought house to house, room to room. In the end, a massive German army was surrounded and destroyed, marking a decisive psychological and military shift. The myth of German invincibility was broken, and the Red Army began a relentless, bloody push westward. Simultaneously, in the deserts of North Africa, American and British forces achieved key victories, driving the Axis out and securing the Mediterranean. This success paved the way for the grueling invasion of Italy, forcing the fascist government to collapse and forcing German troops into a slow, bitter retreat up the Italian peninsula. But the most highly anticipated, secretive moment of the entire war came on June 6, 1944. Following months of meticulous planning and a brilliant deception campaign known as Operation Fortitude, which used fake radio traffic and inflatable tanks to fool the enemy into expecting an attack elsewhere, the Allies struck. On D-Day, under the supreme command of American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Operation Overlord was launched. It remains the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Over 150,000 American, British, Canadian, and other Allied troops crossed the English Channel. As the ramps of their Higgins boats dropped, these young men charged into a storm of machine gun fire across the heavily fortified, obstacle-strewn beaches of Normandy, France. The fighting, particularly at Omaha Beach, was ferociously deadly. Men scaled towering cliffs under fire and fought through dense, blinding hedgerows. Through immense, breathtaking courage and sacrifice, the Allies miraculously secured a foothold in Western Europe. The liberation of the continent had begun. Over the ensuing months, Allied armies broke out of Normandy, and by August, the streets of Paris were liberated to joyous celebrations. A relentless, mechanized push toward the German border began. The desperate Axis forces launched a massive surprise winter counterattack through the Ardennes forest, creating a dangerous bulge in the American lines. In the bitter cold of the Battle of the Bulge, surrounded American paratroopers in the town of Bastogne famously refused to surrender, holding the line until reinforcements arrived. The Allied lines held firm, the German offensive was crushed, and the final, inevitable path to victory in Europe was now open. Part 8. The End of World War II and the Birth of a New World. The spring of 1945 brought the final, dramatic, and deeply tragic chapters of the conflict in Europe. Allied forces advanced rapidly from the west, crossing the Rhine River into the German heartland, while Soviet forces closed in from the east. It was during this advance that Allied soldiers uncovered the darkest, most horrific secret of the Nazi regime: the concentration and extermination camps. The liberation of these camps revealed the full, incomprehensible extent of the Holocaust to a shocked world, cementing the absolute moral necessity of the Allied victory. Finally, Soviet and Western forces converged on the smoldering ruins of Berlin. With their leader dead by his own hand, the remnants of the German military surrendered. The European war officially concluded in May 1945, bringing immense relief to a shattered continent on Victory in Europe Day. However, halfway across the globe, the conflict in the Pacific raged on with terrifying intensity. The Allied island-hopping campaign had reached the very doorstep of Japan. Battles like Iwo Jima, immortalized by the raising of the American flag on Mount Suribachi, and Okinawa, featured unprecedented brutality. Japanese defenders refusing to surrender fought to the death, and the skies were filled with kamikaze pilots launching suicide attacks on Allied ships. Military planners in Washington faced a horrifying calculation. An amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands would likely cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of American and Japanese lives. Seeking to end the war swiftly, newly sworn-in President Harry S. Truman made one of the most agonizing decisions in human history. He authorized the use of a terrifying new technology, developed in absolute secrecy in the desert laboratories of the Manhattan Project. In August 1945, a single American bomber dropped an atomic weapon on the city of Hiroshima, and days later, a second on Nagasaki. The unimaginable destructive power of these weapons leveled the cities in an instant, forever altering the nature of warfare. Faced with total, instantaneous destruction, the Empire of Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in September 1945, finally bringing an end to the most destructive, widespread conflict in human history. The global cost was staggering. An estimated 70 to 85 million lives were lost, and countless ancient cities were reduced to rubble. Yet, from these apocalyptic ashes, a profound determination arose to ensure such a catastrophe would never happen again. Leaders gathered to establish the United Nations, hoping to foster global cooperation, human rights, and peaceful diplomacy. The old European empires, exhausted and bankrupt, began to dissolve. In their place, a complex new geopolitical reality emerged, dominated by two massive superpowers, the democratic United States and the communist Soviet Union. The alliance that had defeated fascism quickly fractured, setting the stage for a decades-long ideological struggle known as the Cold War. The modern world as we know it with all its enduring institutions, underlying tensions, and technological realities, was born directly from the crucible of this era of profound trial. As we look back at the history of the First and Second World Wars, we are reminded of the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit. We see the profound tragedies that unfold when diplomacy fails and aggression goes unchecked. But we also witness the incredible bravery, unity, and resilience of those who stood firm in the defense of freedom. Entire generations sacrificed their youth, and many gave their lives to secure the world we inhabit today. Their stories are not just pages in a history book. They are vital lessons in courage, responsibility, and the enduring value of peace. It is our duty to remember their sacrifices and to pass these lessons down to future generations. Thank you for taking this journey through time with us. If you found this deep dive into our shared past meaningful, please consider subscribing to the Historical Decoder. Join our community as we continue to explore the fascinating people, pivotal moments, and profound events that have shaped the human experience. Until next time, keep exploring, keep remembering, and keep decoding history.